Hello and greetings from UB. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, we are delighted you are able to join us for today's webinar presentation. My name is Christy Fields and I'm the Director of Alumni Lifelong Engagement here at UB. I'm also joined by my wonderful colleague Joy Rona, who will assist in monitoring any questions. We are both so grateful you are able to join us today, and I hope you and your family are staying well. It is my honor to welcome today's featured presenter, Dr. Nallan Suresh, UB's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Operations Management and Strategy in the UB School of Management. He is also Associate Director for UB's Stephen Still Institute for Sustainable Transportation and Logistics. Dr. Suresh specializes in manufacturing, logistics, and supply chain management. He is a leading researcher and educator in supply chain management, lean manufacturing, logistics management, and production planning and control. His current research work is in the areas of supply chain agility, disruption risk mitigation and response, and application of blockchain and IoT technologies in supply chains. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed some major weaknesses in global supply chains, most notably in the supply of everyday groceries and for medical supplies, personal protective equipment, and ventilators. There is currently a need to reflect and synthesize all the lessons learned thus far through the era of hurricanes, COVID-19, and other events, and systematically diagnose the underlying vulnerabilities plaguing current supply chains. As we now attempt to recover from the COVID-19 disruptions, we are starting to witness an across-the-board increase in consumer demand. At the same time, new constraints have emerged on the supply side, which are stifling economic recovery and increasing inflation risks. In today's session, Dr. Suresh will summarize these causes, lessons learned, and provide some actions that are critically needed by way of both mitigation and fast response. We will leave some time during today's webinar for Q&A. If at any point in time you have some questions during the presentation, go ahead and submit them through your GoToWebinar taskbar. There's a question section on your screen and you can chat those to us at any time. And then in addition, we'll be recording today's session and we'll send you all a copy within the next 24 hours. So with that said, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our featured presenter, Dr. Nallan Suresh, UB Distinguished Professor in the Department of Operations Management and Strategy here at the University of Buffalo School of Management. Welcome, Dr. Suresh.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And today is December 1. We're just winding up the year. It has been another COVID year, and I hope all of you are doing well. And hopefully the next year will be a much better year. And so I've titled this Looking Beyond COVID-19, even though I guess we are very much still in the throes of COVID-19. In fact, I just had to introduce a new word called Omicron in one of the slides, which when I made up the slides a few days ago, the Omicron variant was simply not there. And now this is a new variable to contend with. Right? So this is today's agenda. I thought we could proceed this way. First, we could look at the current and new problems as we attempt to recover from COVID-19. We are still struggling to recover from COVID-19, right? So let's also quickly summarize some of the advances we have made in supply chain management over the years and some of the lessons we have learned from COVID-19. And these pandemics have proved to be quite different from the disruptions of the past. And so what are some of the new things we have learned in this pandemic phase? And then, so basically two things. What are the things we need to do in the short term in terms of supply chain resilience? And what are the things we need to do in the long term? Good. Right now, we are busy fighting all the new bottlenecks in the supply chain, but we should also think about the long-term things we need to do in the supply chain. So I thought I would break it up into two categories, short-term and long-term. And then after that, we could have the Q&A. Okay, so as all of us know, we are entering a world of increasing uncertainty. They call it VUCA. This VUCA is just an acronym. people use. I'm sure you've heard of this acronym called VUCA. It simply stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So, in other words, we are entering an era of unknown unknowns, and everything seems to be so unpredictable and totally out of our control, right? So, as we enter that era, we have had quite a few calamities during the last several decades, and they seem to be happening at a much greater magnitude than before. We've had quite a few hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on. We've had tsunamis, and we've had combination incidents. For example, the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan in 2011 was a combination of an earthquake and a tsunami that triggered this nuclear accident. It's a triple whammy, you might say. So that's the kind of thing that's happening today. And we've had our share of hurricanes, and we have been going through this period of trade wars during the last 5 years, and tariffs and so on. Now there's pandemics, we've had cyber attacks, terrorism incidents, climate change events, etc. What next? Maybe an asteroid hit. In fact, same time, in fact, last year, April 2020, when we were all preoccupied with this COVID-19, an asteroid actually came very close to the Earth. It was just about 3 times the distance of the moon, but nobody noticed it because we were so preoccupied with what's happening on this planet, right? So we just don't know what the next event is going to be. So how do we prepare ourselves to face all kinds of disruptions possible and so on? So the question of the day is, how should we make supply chains more resilient? Okay, that's the hot topic. This is the asteroid news. And okay, now just as we are struggling to come out of COVID-19, the good news is consumer demand has been picking up in almost all the industries. So there's been an across the board increase in consumer demand. That's a good thing. That means we should be on the pathway to economic recovery, right? But then the problem is we've had quite a few constraints on the supply side, which is now stifling economic recovery. And it's also because of this supply demand imbalances, high demand coupled with low constraints on the supply side, it has also introduced the inflation risk. And right now we are faced with all kinds of impediments in all segments of global supply chains. Let's say, for example, a typical global supply chain might start in a far off country like Taiwan or China or Taiwan or Vietnam, wherever. And first of all, we are having quite a few constraints on the producing stage itself, in the production stage itself. For example, looking at China has been undergoing quite a few production cutbacks because of shortages in power. There's a coal shortage. Right now, China is also going through a trade war with Australia, which has affected the coal supply in China, and then that has reduced the power supply to industry. And on account of that, the production cutbacks have taken place in China. And also thanks to because of COVID, there's a lot of restricted mobility of workers. In China, there's a lot of migrant labor working in Chinese factories, especially in the southern provinces like Guangdong. Most of it's migrant labor. Now with this COVID, there is restricted mobility and availability of labor, and restricted working hours due to COVID-19, etc. Likewise, Chinese are also having problems on their export ports. Like they have very big ports. For example, the world's biggest port is off of Shanghai, the Yangshan Deepwater Port. But we've had problems in this big port, Ningbo, which is south of Yangshan. And so we've had all kinds of constraints at the producing stage itself. And now we've got bottlenecks in the consumer nations. Like if you look at the United States, some of the biggest logistics bottlenecks have been on the West Coast ports, particularly the 2 ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, as they were very much in the news. All the long queues of ships waiting to be unloaded, and there is shortage of containers, shortage of chassis. There's also shortage of truck drivers. So we've had constraints on the consumer nations as well. And alongside this, they have big disruptions of the labor market. Now, there are quite a few job openings. That's a good news. And paradoxically, not enough takers. That means people are now looking for better jobs. During the COVID year, people have been enjoying kind of a better work-life balance because they've been working from home. It's been a little more family-friendly, I guess. So people are looking for better jobs, and they're looking for more friendly working conditions and so on. And so we've had all these problems, and now suddenly this is the new bullet point I had to introduce just a few days ago. So now we have this Omicron variant, and what's going to be the impact of Omicron variant is the big question for the day. Yesterday, for example, it had a huge disruption in the stock market. But I see that today the stock market, the good news on the stock market, the Dow Jones is up more than 400 points. It is recovered today, but yesterday this Omicron variant uncertainty created a big drop in the Dow Jones and the stock markets and so on. So those are some of the new problems as we now try to recover from COVID-19. Now, one of my hobbies is I'm a landscape painter on the side, and back in October 2019, I had made this painting, which I had called The Office of the Future. Now, this painting, I thought one day in the future, there'll be much better work-life balance, and this is how office work is going to be. And I never expected COVID-19 to hit us just a few months later. And so it is kind of, looking back, these are the kinds of things that are happening in the world. Okay, so at this stage, we are now entering the holiday shopping season, and these are some of the things that we are going to expect. We were told that consumers will have less choice. We may not get all the good variety of products that we used to have before. We may not be able to get exactly what we want. We have to be prepared for longer lead times, non-availability of goods, and the net result is more people are going to be ordering things online. They're going to be faced with higher prices, less discount offerings, and so on. So we've been advised, shop early and avoid Christmas rush. Now, this is a very traditional alert at this time of the year. It acquires more significance this year. Shop early and avoid the Christmas rush becomes more important, even more important this year. So this is what we've been expecting. But the last few days, the news has been very good. And now it turns out that it may not be so bad as we thought, after all, for the simple reason that all the port bottlenecks were created because of advanced ordering by retailers. That means the retailers have already finished the stocking up for the season, and they were the ones who were causing all the bottlenecks in the West Coast ports. That's the latest insight that we are getting to the last few days. So it may not be that bad as we thought it's going to be. So that's a good news. And also domestic logistics firms like FedEx, UPS, DHL, they're all reacting very well to speed up the deliveries. So hopefully it's not going to be as bad as we were told it's going to be this shopping season and so on. So against this backdrop, let's take a quick look at all the advances we have made in supply chain during the last 2 or 3 decades. And especially if we talk about the food supply chain in America, is one of the miracles which we tend to take it for granted. America's food supply chain is one of the best in the world. There's always been plentiful, great variety of products available for the consumer, very affordable products, very high quality supplies, and wide variety of products. And all these we have enjoyed all these years, but we have tended to take them for granted. So only during the COVID year, we were alerted to the fact that what we took for granted all these years may not be around forever. And so what's been happening is we have lived in by and large, a very steady state world all these years, and the supply chains have been very, very efficient. They've been very, very lean and very, very efficient, and operating with very low inventory levels and high inventory turnover ratios and so on. Only during the last 10 or 15 years, when we've had quite a few hurricanes and that kind of climate-related disruptions, did we realize that we need to be a little agile as well. In addition to being lean, we also need to be agile and responsive. And we have learned a lot of lessons from the era of the hurricanes. Now the pandemics have proved to be slightly different from the era of the hurricanes, as we will see later. So we have made lots of advances in supply chain, but still we have realized that there are very major shortcomings in supply chains as well. So during the COVID years, the problems that we have faced in the grocery and food supply chains, also when it comes to medical devices, personal protection equipment, those are some of the supply chains all of us felt in a very tangible first-hand way, some of the problems that we faced. For example, there was a lot of panic buying and hoarding behavior on the part of consumers, and we experienced shortages of hand sanitizers, toilet tissues, and all kinds of little products that we took for granted all these years. And so likewise, we have faced a lot of problems for medical equipment, ventilators, and all the medical supplies, personal protection equipment, all those kinds of things. Now, so thanks to these events, we have learned a lot of lessons from this pandemic era. Now, one thing we realized was our forecasting systems not as good as it should be. We did not anticipate panic buying properly. We did not anticipate panic. Even though over the years, demand forecasting techniques have become very sophisticated. We now use artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, all kinds of very sophisticated mathematical tools for forecasting the demand, but still not good enough. That's what the pandemic told us. And we were also not monitoring consumer demands in other countries. For example, last year, around March 2020, there was plenty of experience that was being generated overseas. For example, all the panic buying and all the retail level problems were faced in countries like South Korea, which we did not quite watch and learn. And so there are a lot of lessons to learn from what's happening in other countries which were hit by the COVID earlier than us, those kinds of things. That means we are not monitoring consumer behavior overseas. And we are also not reassuring consumers to deter hoarding, etc. And we also learned some lessons on rationing supplies. Like each family can only buy so much medical hand sanitizers and so on. That rationing mechanisms were introduced after a long time in our retail supply chains. Those are some of the new things we did, and so on. We were simply not reacting fast enough, and we were still operating on a lean mode, even though we were entering a volatile situation, and so on. And there was lots of rigidities in the food supply chains, like especially contractual rigidities. Companies got into long-term contracts with their suppliers and distributors. We learned that we needed to be more flexible. We needed to be more flexible. For example, during the COVID year, when it comes to the demand for food products, now the demand for food products in restaurant channels were reduced because people couldn't go out and dine out. People could not dine out. So the demand for food products in the restaurant channels was down. At the same time, the demand for food products during the at-home consumption increased, but the industry was not able to quickly reroute the supplies from the restaurant channels to the consumer channels quickly because of all the contractual rigidities. And those are some lessons we learned during this time. We also learned how to reorganize work in a safer way, in a more social distanced way, etc. But the biggest lessons we learned out of this COVID episode was our over-dependence on key suppliers. In every supply chain, there are always very major producers, and the whole industry was dependent on those major suppliers. For example, if you take vaccines, for instance, you have this one company in India called the Serum Institute, Not many people have heard of the company, but that Serum Institute is the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. And we have put all the eggs in that one basket. Likewise, if you look at semiconductors, we are dependent on one big company in Taiwan called TSMC. That kind of over dependence on a few suppliers, that is the big weakness in almost all supply chains. The logic was when you concentrate so much production in one area, you get huge economies of scale advantage that brings down the cost. But then, as we said, we're putting all the eggs in one basket. That is the thing that needs to be avoided. That's the big lesson we learned. Likewise, over-dependence on certain geographical regions, like most of the suppliers being in one country, like in Taiwan, in the case of semiconductors, or in China for almost all of the products. That kind of over-dependence on geographical regions. So perhaps the biggest lesson we have learned from the COVID is the big need to diversify our supply sources. That is, these are some of the lessons we have learned in COVID. Now, the thing about pandemics is, unlike hurricanes, pandemics are global events. In the case of hurricanes, hurricanes are regional events. So let's say, for example, if there's a hurricane in Florida or Louisiana, we could always ship products from other states to those affected areas. Because hurricanes are regional events, you can easily ship products from other regions to meet the demand. But in the case of pandemics, it's a nationwide event or it's a global event, so that cross-regional shipments are not possible. That's one of the constraints we faced. Likewise, we also faced a lot of constraints in the supply side. We could not scale up production quickly because on the production side, we had to redesign the workspace to be more safe, more social distanced, and safer workplace, etc. So we could not quickly scale up the production just at the time when we wanted to, and so on. These are all some of the things that new lessons we learned from the pandemics compared to the hurricane era of the past. All right, so, okay. Now, in the case of semiconductor supply chains, which is affecting the economic recovery, now semiconductors are used in almost all products that we use during the day, and this disruption of the semiconductor industry started during the trade war period. A few years before COVID-19 came along, during the trade war, we had new restrictions on US-made chips being made available to Chinese companies, for instance. And the Chinese companies like Huawei, they started hoarding chips, they started cornering supply sources, etc. That was probably one of the first disruptive events in the semiconductor supply chain. Then COVID-19 came along. There was a big demand for consumer electronics, gaming products, etc., because people were working from home. They were buying more computers, more equipment for their Zoom operation, gaming devices, etc. So that shifted the demand patterns during the COVID-19. And after COVID-19, the demand patterns again tried to become normal again. Now, alongside this, there were a lot of disruptions. There was a big fire in Renesas electronics plant in Japan. There was even a winter storm in Texas in February, which affected the chip production in Samsung and NXP. And down in Taiwan, there was a water shortage. The semiconductor industry needs a lot of water, and that affected the production in TSMC. This TSMC is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It is the world's biggest company. It makes more than 60% of all the chips manufactured in the world. And there's this huge concentration of production of chips in Asian countries, especially in Taiwan. So these are some of the problems that afflicted semiconductor industry supply chains, but that is very emblematic of almost all other supply chains. Right? So what are the things we need to do in the short run? Now, in the short term, we are going to be preoccupied by, we are going to be fighting one bottleneck after another. Right now, we are fighting the big bottleneck in the West Coast ports. We are trying to make the 24/7 operation of Long Beach and Los Angeles ports. And After we address that, something else might become the bottleneck. So we're going to be fighting one bottleneck after another in the short term. When I say short term, I'm talking about 1 year or 2 year, that 1 or 2 year time horizon. And we're going to be looking into our supply chains, reducing vulnerabilities everywhere and increasing the resilience. And we're going to improve our supply chain practices by better demand management and forecasting. As we said, we could not quite anticipate panic buying on the part of consumers, etc. And likewise, we're going to make the supply chains not so lean, but lean plus agile type of networks. That means you're going to have some inventories, extra capacity in critical places in the supply chain, and better sourcing practices, better logistics processes, and also more robustness to climate change events. That means we're going to make sure that every node in the supply chain is robust to climate change events like hurricanes and so on. And of course, we'll always be trying to make this everything more sustainable and green and so on. So in the short run, we're going to be working on all of these. Now, specifically, what are the kinds of things we'll be doing is, now we start off with a supply chain map. Now, every industry formally draws this map of, here we have the upstream suppliers and the first tier suppliers, then the manufacturing companies, the wholesalers, the retailers, and finally the end consumers. Now we're going to be, for every industry, we have a lot more steering committees for every supply chain these days, working across different types of companies, manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, etc. And we're going to be looking systematically at the points of vulnerability, and we are going to come up with good mitigation strategies. Mitigation is anticipatory. What are the kinds of things that could go wrong? So mitigation is more preventative. Mitigation means you're trying to anticipate and preemptively design the supply chain to be robust. And response, now after an event has occurred, how quickly can you respond? So that is the second part of the equation, that is response. So we have to come up with good mitigation strategies and response strategies in every part of the supply chain. And that's what we're starting to do systematically. And as we know, lots of things can go wrong in a supply chain. Murphy's Law operates everywhere. There could be wrong demand forecast. When there is a wrong demand forecast, but that means if the retailer overestimates the demand, that's going to end up, they're going to create inventories everywhere, which have to be sold with a sale sign. And likewise, if there is when we underestimate the demand, that's an opportunity cost, that's lost profits for the whole supply chain. So when we say wrong forecasts, it could be on account of overestimating the demand or underestimating the demand. That creates a chain reaction in the supply chain. There could be late deliveries, poor quality, absenteeism, unexpected holidays, lots of things can go wrong. Speculation, when there is less transparency, insufficient information sharing in the supply chain, people start to indulge in speculation, as often happens in the gasoline. Right now, the gas prices are very high, and there's a lot of speculation in the gasoline supply chains because everybody's second guessing each other, and the net result is it increases the costs for everyone, which is passed on to the consumer, right? So and so on. So lots of things can go wrong in a supply chain, and we got to be mindful of Murphy's Law. In fact, we have to operate on this principle that Murphy was an optimist. Murphy was actually an optimist. That should be our operating principle. We have to anticipate everything that can go wrong, and so on. And so in the supply chain map, we have to look for all the areas prone to disruption. We have to create redundancies in capacity. In critical parts of the supply chain, we have to have reserve capacity. We got to have capacity buffer. Likewise, in critical parts of the supply chain, we have to stockpile inventory. Even though it goes against the principle of being lean, at least in the critical parts of the supply chain, we have to have inventory buffer. We have to have multiple suppliers. We cannot be too dependent on single suppliers. We got to have backup suppliers. We have to avoid all kinds of over-dependence, etc. So on the supply chain map, we have to systematically identify points of vulnerability and preemptively go for these mitigation strategies and so on. Right now we have, for example, in the gasoline situation, we have this inventory buffer called strategic petroleum reserves. Now, President Biden just released from the strategic petroleum reserves to address the escalating gas prices. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So in the supply chain, we have to systematically address first on the demand side, what are all the risks of disruption and internal disruptions, and then on the supply side. And lots of things can go wrong in the logistics side as well, and warehousing and transportation and so forth. So we have to systematically address all these risks. On the supply side risks, we are talking about dependency on key suppliers, geographical concentration, etc. And internal risks, these are the internal risks, and these are the demand side risks. Panic buying on the part of consumers, demand volatility, all these are all demand side risks. And we also have system level network risks, like cybersecurity issues has become very big. And these are network risks. And geopolitical risks, we have to make sure that we have enough supplies of all kinds of commodities. The problem is nothing is easy to buy anymore. The other side of the planet, we have these big consuming nations, particularly China and India. China and India, the two big nations on the other side of the planet, consuming pretty much every commodity we can think of. So nothing is easy to buy anymore. So that means we need to be, for our supply chains, we need to make sure that we have uninterrupted supply of not only rare minerals, rare chemicals, etc., but also day-to-day materials like aluminum, steel, all kinds of things. China is also onto this Belt and Road Initiative, and that is increasing new sources of risks for other countries. And now here we're talking environmental risks and so on. So we have to analyze these 6 types of risks very systematically for the supply chain and come up with good mitigation and fast response strategies. Now here's a picture that shows how much of materials China consumes. Like China consumes 54% of aluminum, 50% of nickel, etc., etc. As you can see here. So how difficult it can be for other countries to secure uninterrupted supply of commodities. So these are systematic tactics for mitigation, adding capacity selectively, adding inventory, pooling the demand, etc., etc. These are all different strategies we have developed. So in the supply chain map, we got to identify the critical nodes and the critical paths in supply chain maps, make sure that nothing is uninterrupted. We have techniques like this thing called failure mode and effects analysis. Basically, this technique called FMEA, basically it involves anticipating all the different types of failures that can occur. And for each type of failure, what contingency action you're going to take. So that's what this technique is about. It's a very simple technique. You have to systematically identify all the different types of failures that can occur. And then for each type of failure, what action are you going to take to address that potential failure? That's all. Likewise, we have this called value analysis. Keep on asking the question, why? Now, looking at the supply chain map, you have to ask yourself, why are we selected this supplier? Why is this supplier in Italy or in Germany? Keep on asking the question, why? Like a 4-year-old child. These why questions are very difficult to answer, but in that answer, lots of creative solutions can come about. So that is this technique called value analysis. We're questioning the value of everything you got. Keep on asking the question, why? Ask the question, why 5 times, or in some companies, you have to ask the question 7 times. More stress tests and simulations. Now, the banking industry and the financial service industry does a good job of doing stress tests and simulation, but manufacturing industries don't quite do this. And I think that is the lesson we manufacturing supply chains have to learn from banking and the financial sector. And and we also need a lot of people in the organization who have a tendency to question. These are the people who tend to be negative. They're good at showing how things won't work. And they need those people badly. They need more full-time pessimists who can come up with all possible ways by which things can go wrong. And they're the ones who operate on this principle that Murphy was an optimist, and so on. So we have quite a few risk management tools available, but they need to be used more systematically within companies, and so on. So these are the things that we should be doing in the short term. We are going to be preoccupied relieving one bottleneck after another. We're going to be reducing vulnerabilities. We're going to apply all these risk management tools systematically in the supply chain, etc. Now let's look at the long term. Now in the long term, and we need to create supply chains with a broader supply base. In other words, diversify our supply chains. We also need to cultivate more domestic manufacturing capabilities. Now, ever since the 1970s and the 1980s, manufacturing capabilities have been going overseas, and we need to recreate those capabilities we used to have big time. Like when you go to cities in the Midwest, like traditionally manufacturing companies like Cincinnati. I remember going to Cincinnati. In fact, I did my PhD at the University of Cincinnati. I specialized in manufacturing. And back in the late 80s, when I finished my PhD, Cincinnati was a very vibrant manufacturing city, and you can't say the same thing today. And so we need to bring back all this domestic manufacturing capabilities. We also need to create more nearshore manufacturing capabilities. For example, create more manufacturing capabilities in Latin America, for instance. That might actually help the immigration problem as well. When you create more manufacturing activity and more jobs in the Latin American countries, that may address the immigration issue south of the border as well. But those are the kinds of things we need to be doing. In other words, in fact, every country today is now starting to enhance its self-reliance instead of being dependent on other countries to such an extent. I have a nice report which the Australian government came up with 2 or 3 months ago, how to be more self-reliant and how to get away from this China orbit. That was the main objective. It's a wonderful report. It's about 200 pages long, and it's public domain. If anybody is interested in reading that report, I'd be happy to share it with you. You can email me and I can send you the PDF copy. How to create resilience in the Australian supply chains is what that report is about. We also need to come up with new ways of manufacturing, which is less labor dependent. It's primarily because it's so labor dependent that we are sending the jobs to other countries. So we need to come up with completely new ways of manufacturing. We were actually doing it back in the 1980s when we came up with robotics and flexible automation technologies. We were actually doing that, but then with the advent of Asian manufacturing sources, that got sidetracked, but we need to bring those things back. We're also going through big changes in the transportation sector. That is going to change supply chains of the future. We're talking about electrification of cars, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, flying cars. There was this first company called the company called Terrafugia, which came along 15 years ago, actually. And now they're all in a certain stage when it's quite possible that they may take off during this next decade. Flying cars, smart cities, etc. So big changes are happening in the transportation sector. Likewise, big changes going to happen in the infrastructure sector. The infrastructure is the foundation on which supply chains operate, correct? I'll just give it 5 minutes and I'll wrap it up. And All right, so the infrastructure sector is the foundation on which all supply chains work. So, and then you're going to have big changes on the infrastructure side. And I've been going to China for the last 25 years, and year after year, I've seen firsthand the magnificent job the Chinese have done with the infrastructure. I'll talk about it briefly. We'll come back to, we have some lessons to learn from the Chinese on the infrastructure sector now that we are entering that phase. Now, all the highways, the US highways were built during the 1950s. It goes back to the time of Eisenhower. Now it's time to reconstruct the next generation highways and so on. Okay. Then in the future, supply chains will be based more on a circular economy and so on. So these are some of the things that we're actually working on, and the next 10, 15 years is going to be a very exciting time. It's also a changing world. If we look at the major economies of the world, US is still number one in terms of GDP, absolute value, 20 trillion. These are 2020 numbers. And then China is number two with 14.86 trillion, etc. India is number 6. But in terms of the real value of the economy, in terms of PPP adjusted, purchasing power parity adjusted, China's economy has become number one, USA is number 2, and India is a distant number 3. And so this is the new world we're talking about. These will be the major economies. Alongside that, all these years we have created this type of supply chains. Like all the manufacturing is done overseas, and we have become consuming nations. This is the way almost every supply chain is set up. Now, this is not sustainable in the long run. If you look at the China-US supply chain, for instance, if you look at the 2020, the Chinese exports to the US was 434 million, and US exports to China was 124 million. So we had a deficit of $310 billion in 2020. So that means now this is the magnitude of deficits we have been having during the last 15 to 20 years, and it's simply not sustainable in the long run. It is highly asymmetric. That means all the ships coming from China to the US are fully loaded, but they go back slightly empty on the return journey on the Pacific. That's what it is. Now, what's happening is on our side, thanks to this supply chain, we have low prices for consumers. That means we have Walmart prices. That is good. And because of that, we have a high standard of living. On the other hand, it creates loss of jobs, the erosion of the manufacturing base, the technology base, and the mounting trade deficit. On the Chinese side, the lower labor costs, of course. Of course, the labor costs are increasing in China. The fairly constant exchange rates that they maintain, and also this exchange rate differential. That's another big thing that needs to be addressed going forward. China has an excellent infrastructure, which they built during the last 25 years, and a very good FDI-friendly business climate. FDI is foreign direct investment, business climate, etc. So this is the asymmetric trade relationship we have with China, and we are now starting to feel that it's simply unsustainable. It cannot be maintained forever, etc. And so, looking at the China's infrastructure, now China built its first highway in 1988. It's a short stretch of 20 kilometers outside Shanghai. Now they've come a long way. China's got the longest network of roads and highways and very state-of-the-art highways in the world. Now, this was their initial plan that they had, but it was going so fast that they revised their target upwards to this system called 7-9-18 network system. And the 7 stands for 7 capital radials, 9 stands for north-south highways, etc., etc. And so the Chinese infrastructure performance is something of a miracle. And there are some lessons to be learned now that we are getting into the next generation of infrastructure. Likewise, China excels in high-speed rails. This is the high-speed rails between Wuhan and Guangzhou. And incidentally, I have a personal connection with Wuhan. I used to be a visiting professor in Wuhan until 4 or 5 years ago. It's been 4 years since I went to Wuhan. I have lots of friends in Wuhan, and I used to be a visiting professor. It's going to be a few more years since I get back. But fortunately, all my friends are doing well in spite of all the. So this is the Wuhan railway station. This is the train going to Guangzhou. So likewise, China has done a phenomenal job in terms of high-speed railways and so on. So looking forward, we need good mitigation strategies. We need good response strategies. And these are the things that we will be preoccupied in the long term, diversifying our supply chains in conjunction with all the big things that are happening in transportation and also the big things that are happening on the infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So I will stop here and open up for questions.
Fantastic, Dr. Suresh. Thank you so much for taking time today to share your knowledge and expertise with us. I'm going to start here with a few questions that have come through, but anyone else who has any additional questions, feel free to keep submitting them through the chat section, the question box on your screen, and get those over to us. But Dr. Suresh, this first question that has come through, stating specifically, how would you go about solving USA's current supply chain problems, and what would you do first?
I see. Now, that's a good question. Now, we need to do lots of things when it comes to supply chains. We have to categorize them into all the things that we need to do in the short term and all the things we need to do simultaneously for the long term. That means in the short term, we need to address all the problems that we mentioned here. In the short term, we have to do these. Sorry, yeah. So that means we're going to be right now preoccupied with attacking one bottleneck after another and reducing the vulnerabilities, increasing the resilience of supply chains, and all the things that I mentioned here. These are the agenda for the short term, better risk management tools, coming up with good mitigation strategies and response strategies. That means every supply chain doing all these things internally. These are the things, we have a long agenda of things to be done in the short term. Simultaneously, we need to address the long-term actions, which has to do with diversifying our supply chain. That means we got to not over-rely on certain suppliers. We need to, long-term, these are the things we need to be doing long-term. That means we need to have a broader supply base. We need to be diversifying our supply chains. And we also have to create more domestic manufacturing capabilities. We need to enhance our self-reliance and reduce our dependence on overseas supply chains. I'm not actually arguing for less global trade, but we need global trade with less risks involved. That's what I mean, and so on. So we have a long set of actions to be taken both in the short term and the long term. And I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. This next question here, do you think significant government intervention is necessary to fix supply chain issues, or will the market forces correct the issues?
Now, that is an ideological question. Now, now, do we believe in free markets or do we believe in governmental intervention? That is an ideological question. But I would say a little bit of both, is sensible. I think one has to be pragmatic. Now, I'm a firm believer in the market forces and less governmental intervention. At the same time, there are some things the government can do as well. Now, if you look at the other extreme, China, for example, is a state capitalism, right? So it is a capitalist nation. At the same time, the big arm of the government is, especially the way China is now interfering in the tech sector, you know, the heavy hand of the government in almost all sectors. So personally, I would say, even though we do believe in free markets and such, government also has a role to play, especially in creating and formulating a new industrial policies, incentive. I think the government can play the role of a good regulator. You can create incentives to bring manufacturing back, those kinds of things. So I think the government has a role to play. At the same time, we should let the markets do their work as well. So a little bit of both, without being too ideological. And that's my personal take. I don't know if you agree with that.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. This next question submitted here, what role does 3D printing have in solving supply chain issues?
Oh, yes. 3D printing is a very exciting new technology based on this additive manufacturing. Those are the kinds of new types of manufacturing technologies we need to invest in more and take labor out of the equation. Now, the thing is, when you have completely new ways of manufacturing, it's possible. If we have the will to do it, we will get it done. And the America's always been known for its innovation and resilience and new ways of doing things. And technologies like additive manufacturing, 3D printing, they may quite address the problem of reducing our dependence on labor. That would definitely help in making manufacturing more economical domestically or near shore wise. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Suresh, this next question here, how much of a problem is due to the limited number of companies controlling large percentage of an industry?
Yeah. Concentration, consolidation happens in many industries. It is hard to give an across-the-board answers because every industry is different. And by and large, I don't think that's too much of a problem right now. There is plenty of competition going around, and we do have good antitrust laws in place. So personally, I don't see that as too much of an issue.
Great, thank you. Absolutely. We are getting close to the top of the hour here, and I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Suresh, for really spending time with us today. And like I said earlier, just sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your research with us. We are so grateful for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We're so grateful. As a reminder to everyone, we have recorded today's session, and we're going to send you that link within the next 24 hours. So keep an eye on your inbox. You'll receive an email from us, and it'll include a link to the recording of today's session. If you'd like to go back and re-listen to it, absorb some more information, you'll have that opportunity to do so. We'll also make sure Dr. Suresh's email's in there. He also had his LinkedIn URL on his first slide and his website info. We'll make sure you have that in case you do have any follow-up questions or just some discussion that you'd like to have with Dr. Suresh. He's been so kind to share that information. In addition, save the date for next Wednesday, December 8th. We're going to be joined by Dr. Suresh's colleague, UB School of Management Dean Dr. Paul Teslick. He's going to share how you multiply your impact through shared leadership. So plan on joining us next Wednesday as we continue our webinar series. More information again in tomorrow's follow-up email. You can also find it on our website at any time. We have all of our upcoming webinars as well as an archived page as well of all of our past webinars that you can go back and rewatch. So feel free to take advantage of that as well. With that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Suresh for any closing remarks.
Oh, yes. So it is a real pleasure. In fact, making up these slides during the last few days have really helped me to organize my thoughts a little better. And it has also opened up new questions. The Omicron, when I started making up the slides 3 or 4 days ago, I'd simply not, I've never heard of this thing called Omicron, because actually I was away in Asia, and I got back on Sunday night, and I missed the news coming out of South Africa and so on. So it's been a great opportunity for me to collect my thoughts on this issue. And thanks for having me in the program.
All right, thank you so much. And Dr. Suresh, I did see one more question come through. So if you have a minute,
Sure.
I'll go back to this last question and then we'll wrap things up for the day. But how important is it to digitalize the manufacturing industries to solve SCM challenges? Many firms are moving towards Industry 4.0.
Oh, yes. Now, the Industry 4.0 is another big major revolution that's happening, the increasing digitalization of manufacturing operations that would greatly improve the efficiencies, and that will greatly reduce the costs of manufacturing, and definitely address the supply chain coordination issues. Industry 4.0 is a great revolutionizing the manufacturing activity big time. And at the same time, we have to address, Industry 4.0 is an extremely important development, but at the same time, we need to address the big questions of creating more resilience in our supply chains. That should not be forgotten. That should not be. So side by side with all the technology development, like Industry 4.0, blockchains again are going to revolutionize supply chains. So side by side with all these technologies, we should not forget the fundamental problem facing us today, which is the absence of resilience in our supply chains. Yeah, so.
Excellent. Thank you again, Dr. Suresh. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you again on a future webinar. Dr. Suresh, thank you for keeping us continue to keep us updated on this. We are very thankful for you taking the time today. Thank you all. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.